Hi, welcome to our channel of IGNOU Audiobooks. Indira Gandhi National Open University, School of Continuing Education, Certificate Programs, Certificate in Rural Development, CRD, MRD-101, Rural Development Indian Context, Block-1, Rural Society and Economy, Unit-4, Rural Economic Structure. 4.0, Objectives. After going through this unit, you should be able to explain the role of agriculture as a sustaining source of economic activity in the country. Describe the nature of inequality in the distribution of land and other assets in rural areas. Explain the problems of rural credit markets. Explain and apply the key concepts in defining the employment status, and analyze the trends in the incidence of agricultural labor and those in agricultural wages. 4.1, Introduction. This unit gives an overall view of the trends in the growth of rural economy and the structure of production relations in rural India. In the process of production, rural workers enter into various kinds of economic relationships with each other. It is through these relationships cultivators get access to land, credit, labor and other resources, and landless workers get access to employment. A study of rural economic structure is essentially a study of these economic relationships. Due to the great heterogeneity that is inevitable in a country as large as India, the information provided in this unit will need supplementation from your own regional context. At different places in the unit, you will find exercises to help you check how much of the material presented in this unit you have understood. In addition, two small activities have been suggested to help you further develop your understanding of the theme presented here. 4.2, Agriculture, Basic Characteristics. Let us start by discussing the importance of agriculture in Indian economy. After over 5 decades of planned economic development, India continues to have a predominantly rural economy. In 1950-51, the primary sector contributed nearly 60% of all the goods and services produced domestically, which is called Gross Domestic Product, GDP, in economic terms. By 1999 to 2000, this had declined to 29%. In 1951, cultivators and agricultural laborers accounted for 69% of the country's total workforce. In 200I, the percentage was 58. Thus, the share of the value of goods and services produced by the agricultural sector has diminished much more than the decline in the number of people depending directly on the activities of this sector. Table 4.1 shows the share of cultivators and agricultural laborers in the rural and the total labor force in 2001. Cultivators and agricultural laborers accounted for about 70% of the rural male labor force in 2001. In the case of rural female labor, the percentage was even greater, amounting to about 80%. As a percentage of the total labor force in the country, agricultural laborers and cultivators accounted for 52% of male and 71% of female labor, respectively. This illustrates the continuing importance of the agricultural sector in the lives of the Indian people. Table 4.1, Cultivators and agricultural labor in the workforce, main and marginal, 2001. Look at the screen for table content. Indian agriculture depends upon the monsoon, which provides 74% of the country's annual rainfall and is the chief source of water. The distribution of this rainfall, however, is uneven both with respect to time and with respect to region. This is an important determinant of a very large diversity in agricultural cropping systems. In different parts of India, dependence on the monsoon also exposes Indian farmers to vagaries of the weather. 4.3, Cropping Pattern. What are the major crops grown in India? To answer this question, it is necessary To understand the concepts of net sown area, gross cropped area and the index of multiple cropping, net sown area refers to all the land under cultivation. Since the late 1960s, the net sown area in the country has not changed significantly as there has been little scope for bringing additional land under cultivation. However, expansion in availability of irrigation has made it possible to increase the area on which more than one crop is grown in a single year. Gross cropped area refers to the total land under cultivation, counting each field as many times as the number of crops grown on it in a single year. The ratio of gross cropped area to net sown area is the index of multiple cropping. By the end of 1990s, the index of multiple cropping or cropping intensity was about 135%, which indicates that there is substantial potential for extending double cropping to areas that are still single cropped. In 1999 to 2000, only about 41% of gross cropped area was irrigated. Extending the availability of irrigation to areas that are still under rainfed agriculture is crucial for the further expansion of double cropping. Table 4.2 shows the importance of different crops in Indian agriculture. Rice accounts for about 24% of the gross cropped area and wheat for about 14.6% of the gross cropped area. The share of area under millets, or coarse cereals, and pulses has fallen over the last 3 decades. In 1999 to 2000, all millets accounted for about 15.6% and pulses accounted for about 11.6% of the gross cropped area. Table 4.2 Percentage distribution of gross cropped area across various crops. India, 1998-99. Look at the screen for table content. 4.4 Trends in agricultural growth. To understand the path of agricultural growth in modern India, let us first recognize that agricultural growth can occur on account of the growth of cropped area, which might be because of extending agriculture to uncultivated areas or because of the increase in multiple cropping, or because farmers produce more on a unit of land, that is, improvement in per hectare yields. Once we understand these two possibilities, we can divide the progress of agricultural growth in India into 4 distinct phases. The first phase, or what can be called the pre-Green Revolution phase, starting from the onset of the second 5-year plan in 1952 through the mid-1960s, was a period in which agriculture was largely treated as a bargain sector, a sector that could grow without any significant public investment in technological change and capital formation. Agricultural policy in this period was directed to 2 major areas: land reforms, a policy that largely remained confined to paper, and government-financed major and medium irrigation schemes. While the long-term growth in the production of food grains in this period was not unimpressive, 2.9% per annum between 1949-50 and 1964-65, it was largely on account of the increase in cropped area rather than any improvements in agricultural yields. The growth of agricultural production, however, decelerated towards the mid-1960s. As the area available for expansion declined, a series of severe droughts between 1965 and 1967 brought to the fore the intrinsic vulnerability of Indian economy to food shortages caused by the expanding demand for food and/or the dependence of agriculture on the vagaries of weather. Food shortages necessitating an import of about 19 million tons of food grains made it clear that self-sufficiency in the production of food was of paramount importance for national sovereignty. India achieved the goal of self-sufficiency in the production of food grain mainly through the Green Revolution, which was introduced in the mid-1960s. Green Revolution was based on the introduction of new technology in agriculture in selected areas with relatively higher levels of productivity. In this period, the focus of official policy shifted from attacking institutional impediments and removing inequalities in the distribution of land to promoting the growth of marketed surplus generated by relatively large farmers. The new technology was based on the use of new biochemical inputs, most importantly high-yielding varieties of seeds and fertilizers, together with increased and controlled irrigation.
The second phase, the early Green Revolution phase, from mid-1960s through the 1970s, was a period in which the production of food grains grew by about 2.21% per annum and the total agricultural output grew by about 2.29% per annum. You may note that unlike in the first phase, agricultural growth in this phase was largely a result of growth in agricultural yields at a time when the scope for further expansion of area under cultivation was limited. Given the nature of this developmental strategy, agricultural growth in the second phase was sadly unequal across regions, with the north and the northwestern states growing much faster than the eastern and most of the southern parts of India. In the 1980s, which constituted the third or the late Green Revolution phase, agriculture became more broad-based primarily owing to the spread of Green Revolution to eastern India. Over 1980s, food grain production grew at the rate of 2.9% per annum and total agricultural output grew at the rate of about 3.43% per annum. In this period, while agricultural yields stagnated in most of the early Green Revolution areas like Punjab, eastern India showed a marked acceleration in the growth of agricultural output. In particular, in West Bengal, the agricultural success story of the 1980s, agricultural output grew at more than 6% per annum. It is noteworthy that the agricultural strategy between the mid-1960s and 1980s was based on public provisioning of infrastructure, credit, agricultural research and extension. At the same time, institutional mechanisms were built for the government to intervene in the agricultural markets to ensure that on the one hand the farmers got remunerative prices for their produce and on the other food prices in the economy remained low enough to keep inflation in check. In the 1990s, which comprised the fourth phase, agricultural development strategy shifted to primarily relying on the market mechanism to fuel growth and the withdrawal of a range of other supports that were provided by the government. Also, various policy initiatives led to greater integration of the domestic agriculture with the world markets. These changes, the withdrawal of various forms of support in particular, resulted in a marked decline in agricultural growth. In particular, growth in the production of food grains in the fourth phase was the lowest since independence. Table 4.3 Growth of agricultural production 1949-50 to 2001% per annum. Look at the screen for table content. Check your progress. 1. What does Green Revolution refer to? 2. What is the main difference between the agricultural strategy adopted during the period of Green Revolution and that employed in the 1990s? Activity 1. What are the major crops grown in your state? Refer to official publications of the government like the Indian Agricultural Statistics, Indian Agriculture in Brief, etc. 2. Use Table 4.3 to describe the extent to which agricultural growth in different periods was dependent on growth of agricultural yields and growth of the cropped area. 4.5 Animal husbandry and other allied agricultural activities. Let us now look at some other economic activities that take place in the rural areas. An important part of the rural economy are the activities that are closely linked with agricultural production. These are called the allied agricultural activities. Take the case of animal husbandry. Cultivation receives inputs from livestock and in turn provides outputs for livestock in the shape of animal feed. The share of livestock sector in the aggregate national income was about 5.5% in 1999 to 2000. India has a large livestock population. About 16% of the world's cattle and 57% of the world's buffalo population is in India. Of the total livestock population of India in 2000, cattle accounted for about 42%, goats for about 23%, buffaloes for about 18% and sheep for about 11%. Milk is one of the main products of animal husbandry. India is the largest producer of milk in the world. India produces about 85 million tons of milk, which accounts for about 13% of the total milk production in the world. It is noteworthy that there has been a very substantial growth in per capita availability of milk from only about 112 grams per day in 1968-69 to about 213 grams per day in 1998-99. It is noteworthy that a substantial part of this growth has been from the cooperative sector and has been a result of what has been rightly called the White Revolution. The dairy cooperatives functional in 285 districts of India comprise 103,281 village-level societies and over 11 million members. Poultry is said to be the most efficient converter of feed into food fit for human consumption in the shortest possible time. It has become a very important component of the farm economy in India. This sector also provides employment to a large number of people in rural areas. The supply of eggs, important produce of the poultry farms, has increased from 2,340 million eggs in 1961 to an estimated 29,475 million eggs in 1998-99. Andhra Pradesh, Tamil Nadu, Maharashtra, West Bengal and Punjab accounted for more than 60% of the country's egg production in 1998-99.
Fishing is another important economic activity, particularly in the maritime states. This sector provides employment to nearly 2 million people. India has a coastline of 7,517 kilometers. Of this, Gujarat and West Bengal account for more than 2,500 kilometers. In 2001, the total fish catch of India was 5.9 million tons, of which inland fisheries contributed 3.1 million and marine fisheries 2.8 million tons. The maritime states of Gujarat, Maharashtra, Kerala, Tamil Nadu, Andhra Pradesh and West Bengal accounted for about 70% of the total catch. Check your progress. 2.1. What is the importance of livestock in India's rural economy? 4.6. Non-agricultural activities. Non-agricultural activities constitute another important component of the rural economy in India. The share of non-farm rural employment is estimated to range between 26 to 25% of the workforce. The rural non-farm sector is important because of the forward and backward production linkages. Agriculture needs implements and inputs that can be provided either by rural or urban non-agricultural activities. These inputs and products are the backward linkages of the agricultural sector. The forward linkages come into being because of the need to process agricultural produce or because of the demand for non-agricultural products generated by rising incomes in rural areas. Sugarcane and oilseed processing industries are examples of such forward linkages of the agricultural sector. Rural industries can serve as a means of reducing the burden on agriculture by providing employment in rural areas. They can also thereby serve as a means of reducing the inflow of job-seeking workers into cities and towns. According to the 1971 census, the number of workers in rural household industries was 4.74 million. By 2001, this had gone up to 11.7 million. In 2001, workers in rural household industries comprised about 3.8% of the total rural workforce and about 3% of the total workforce of the country. As per the National Sample Survey data for 1999, rural workers comprised about 49% of all workers usually employed in the manufacturing sector. The growth of agriculture over the last few decades suggests that agricultural growth per se will not lead to better conditions for the rural workforce. Growth of rural incomes in the years to come would depend on the diversification of the rural economy by introducing higher value crops, mixed farming practices and non-agricultural activities. It would also require the development of a large number of small and medium towns that can provide the basic necessities and infrastructure necessary for the location of a greater variety of manufacturing activities in what are today called rural and semi-urban areas. 4.7. Size and distribution of rural assets. Let us now turn our attention to the issue of equity in the rural economy. An understanding of the agrarian structure and inequalities in the distribution of assets. will enlighten you about the economic problems that confront the rural society in India. This will also help you to understand the causes of rural poverty. Land is the most important asset of rural households. In 1991, land accounted for 64% of all the assets of rural households. Households operate the land that is owned by them or is obtained through various kinds of lease arrangements. In view of this, it is customary to distinguish between ownership and operational holdings. An ownership holding refers to the area under the legal ownership, khatedari, title of the cultivators. An operational holding is the area managed by a single cultivator and may include own land as well as the land cultivated under a subtenancy or other informal arrangements. The number of operational holdings in India is substantially lower than the number of ownership holdings. In most states, marginal and small holdings, that is, holdings less than 2 hectares in size, account for the bulk of land holdings, and the share of marginal and small land holdings has tended to rise over the last 3 decades. Table 4.4 shows the changes in the distribution of operational holdings in India during the 1970s and 1980s. In 1990-91, marginal and small holdings accounted for nearly 78% of the total number of holdings. Over the years, the number of marginal holdings has increased rapidly. In 1960-61, there were 20 million marginal holdings. Their number increased to 63 million in 1990-91. The growing number of marginal farms creates problems because the farm size is often so small that it acts as a hindrance for the meaningful improvement of land. Very often the land holdings are also fragmented into several plots. This inhibits economies of scale. National Sample Survey of Land and Livestock Holdings for 1991-92 showed that at the national level, average size of a plot of land was about 0.2 hectares and the total number of plots was about 2.67 times the total number of holdings. Since the size of holding is often very small, the cultivator cannot make investments to improve the quality of land. This is particularly so in the case of investment in irrigation facilities. If the plots are scattered over a wide area, the cultivator finds it difficult to undertake expenses to irrigate all his plots. Table 4.4 Distribution of Operational Holdings 1970-71, 1980-81, 1985-86 and 1990-91. Look at the screen for table content. Table 4.4 above shows that the distribution of land in India is highly unequal. Over 78% of the cultivators belonging to the category of marginal and small operators cultivate less than 1/3 of the land. In contrast, less than 2% of the cultivators having holdings of more than 0 hectares each cultivate about 29% of the land. The number of large holdings has declined marginally and the area controlled by them has decreased from 31% in 1970-71 to 17% in 1990-91. Table 4.5 shows the average size of operational holdings across the states in 1990-91. The table shows that the average size of holdings is bigger in states such as Punjab, Haryana, and Gujarat. On the other hand, in eastern states like Bihar and West Bengal, the operational size of these holdings is relatively small. It may be remembered that the regional differences in the structure of holdings are related to the pressure of population on the land, soil, agroclimatic conditions and the extent of irrigation. It is also noteworthy that the economic value and productive potential of small holdings in irrigated areas might be higher than relatively large land holdings in areas where agriculture is largely dependent on rains. Table 4.5 State-wise average size of operational holdings 1990-91. Look at the screen for table content. Cultivation of land under tenancy and crop sharing arrangements is common in most parts of India. These tenancies are often oral tenancies and therefore escape the provisions of the land reform legislation. The status of sharecroppers is worse than that of laborers as they bear the risks of uncertain agriculture and high rents. In most states, such tenants can be evicted by landowners at will. In most parts of India, they do not qualify for the support provided to those who cultivate their own land. Under legal rights provided by the land reform legislation, land reforms have had little effect on this category of the rural population. Recent official statistics clearly bring out two trends in land lease arrangements over the last 2 decades. First, the incidence of reverse tenancy, that is, small landowners leasing out land to large landowners, has been on the rise, and secondly, related to the rise of reverse tenancy, there is an increase in tenancy under fixed rent contracts. While crop share tenancy has tended to decline, NSSO does a survey of rural assets for the Reserve Bank of India, RBI, once in 10 years, the last being the survey of 1991. The survey shows that the land and building is the most important category of assets in rural areas, accounting for 85% of all the assets of rural households. Table 4.6. Durable household goods and livestock and poultry are the next in importance. The distribution of assets remained almost the same between 1971 and 1991. One noteworthy change, however, is the declining share of livestock and poultry in the total asset holding of rural households. This is likely to be primarily a result of increasing mechanization of agriculture and progressive decline in the use of draft animals. Table 4.6. Composition of the assets of rural households, 1991%. Look at the screen for table content dash. Table 4.7 shows that the distribution of assets in rural India is highly unequal. About 50% of the assets are concentrated in the hands of 10% of the richest households, while the poorest 60% of the households have less than 15% of assets. Table 4.7. Distribution of assets by percentiles of rural households, 1991%. Look at the screen for table content dash. Growth and equity have been the principal goals of planned development. While the record on the growth front has been fairly satisfactory, the record on the equity front is not so. Inequalities have not declined. They have become far more visible. Quite naturally, therefore, the focus of rural development policy must continue to be on the poor, the weak and the disadvantaged. 4.8. Rural credit markets. Let us start by asking, why do rural households need credit? Any productive enterprise needs capital. Next to land, capital is necessary for farm investments which enable a farmer to increase production. This problem is particularly more serious in the case of agriculture because there is a time lag between plowing, harvesting and sale of produce which lasts at least 6 to 8 months. The farmer needs credit support for long-term investment in land improvement and irrigation as well as for short-term needs while waiting for the harvest. In addition, the rural poor need credit for a whole range of consumption requirements given seasonality and inadequacy of employment, low wages, and the lack of access to free education and health services. If credit is such an important requirement of rural households, we should know something about where they get the credit from and on what terms they borrow. Traditionally, this support was provided by the landlord-trader money lender who often combined as the same source. This led to an interlinking of the labor, credit, and product markets in exploitative relationships. For instance, a small or marginal farmer borrowing funds from his landlord has to pay a high rate of interest and also agree to work for him on very low remuneration or without receiving any remuneration in the process. This system of credit relations imposes a heavy burden on the borrower. Indebtedness of farmers leading to dispossession of land and other assets or debt bondage of the landless has been widely reported in official as well as non-official documents. The growth of formal sector banking in the rural areas, both through commercial banks and cooperative banking institutions, therefore acquired a great deal of importance.
Starting with the nationalization of banks in the late 1960s, there was a very substantial growth of rural banking. The number of the rural branches of commercial banks increased from 1443 in 1969 to 19,453 in 1981 and 35,216 in 1991. The share of credit disbursed by the rural branches increased from 3.3% in 1969 to 11.9% in 1981 and 14.7% in 1991. Banks were asked to provide 40% of the credit to the priority sector, which included, most importantly, agriculture and small-scale industries sectors. In the decade of 1980s, rural banking was also combined with poverty alleviation programs. The data, however, show that there was a decline in the supply of rural credit in the 1990s. The number of the rural branches of commercial banks fell to 32,673 in 2000. Correspondingly, the share of credit disbursed through the rural branches has fallen to 10.3% in 2000. Also, most banks did not meet the priority sector lending targets in the 1990s. The evidence suggests that this situation led to an increase in the hold of informal sources on rural credit markets, as the decline in the availability of rural credit contributed to the intensification of rural distress in the 1990s. Check your progress. 3. 1. Why do you think it is necessary for banks to provide credit to rural households? 2. Explain briefly in your own words the extent of inequality in the distribution of rural assets in India. Activity 2. If you live in a village, find out the extent of inequality in the distribution of land holdings there. What is the proportion of the landless among the households that live in your village? How much land does the largest landowner have? If you do not live in a village, visit a nearby village and try to collect this information about the village visited. 4.9 Rural employment, key concepts. Unemployment is obviously one of the most serious problems in rural areas. Let us first start by going through the concepts that are important for understanding the problem of unemployment in a developing country where the bulk of employment is in the unorganized sector. In fact, most economic activities in rural India are organized on household basis. As a result, distinctions between workers and non-workers, and between economic and household activities, are not always clear. Women and children perform many essential tasks in activities such as agriculture, upkeep of livestock, household crafts and industry. Nevertheless, they are often excluded from the category of workers because their involvement is neither full-time nor regular. The system of national accounting also has a bias against such work. The traditional national accounting methods do not recognize them as productive activities. Whatever work is done by women and children at home is described as household work and gets excluded from economic activity on account of the bias in reporting. As a result, estimating the number of workers or the unemployed in rural areas is difficult, and the number of female workers is underestimated in most official census and survey reports. Unemployment and underemployment. Underemployment and seasonal unemployment is a characteristic feature of rural labor markets. Underemployment refers to the existence, on the one hand, of idle time, and on the other of low productivity levels. Low productivity is related to the low asset base of workers, and idle time is the result not only of lack of assets, but also of the fact that available work gets distributed among a larger number of workers. The pressure of population and the unequal distribution of land and assets are responsible for the existence of this situation. As the landman ratio goes down, The capacity of land as a supporting asset to rural population is threatened. The only alternative in such a situation is the growth of the non-agricultural sector. Official estimates of unemployment are made on the basis of surveys carried out by NSSO. Estimating rural unemployment is a difficult task. The following are some of the problems in estimating unemployment. A. It is difficult to distinguish work or economic activities from household activities. B. Involvement in economic activities may not be full-time, and C. There are large seasonal variations in work patterns. As a result, it is difficult to give one estimate that can be regarded as an average estimate of the year-round situation. Currently, 3 different concepts/criteria are used to measure unemployment. Before measuring unemployment, it is important to distinguish persons who were not available for work from those who either worked or were available for work, those who actually worked and those who did not get any work but were available for work constitute the total labor force. This clarification helps us in outlining the 3 criteria used for measuring employment in rural India. 1. A person is considered employed by the usual employment status criterion if he or she was working for more than half of the days in the previous year. The unemployment rate by the usual status refers to the percentage of persons in the labor force who were available for work but were unemployed for more than half of the days in the previous year. 2. A person is considered employed by the current weekly status criterion if he/she worked for at least 1 hour during 7 days preceding the date of the survey. Unemployment rate by the weekly status refers to the percentage of persons in the labor force who did not work for even 1 hour out of the days they were available for work in the last 7 days. 3. Current daily status employment refers to the total number of days in the last 7 days that a person, or a group of persons, was employed. Work of less than half a day is regarded as an unemployed day. Unemployment rate by the daily status refers to the proportion of person days when the population was available for work but did not find any work. Let us now use these 3 criteria to look at the trends in employment generation in rural India over the last 2 decades. Between 1983 and 1993-94, rural employment grew annually at the rate of 1.75% by the usual status criterion, 2.53% by the current weekly status criterion and 2.38% by the current daily status criterion. During the 1980s, government expenditure was the main source of employment generation in the rural areas. During this period, government not only undertook employment generation programs on a large scale, but also provided various other kinds of subsidies, credit and other transfers to rural areas, which contributed to the generation of employment, particularly in the non-agricultural sectors. In the 1990s, the rates of employment generation declined in the rural areas largely because of decline in government interventions. The rate of growth of rural employment declined between 1993-94 and 1999-2000 and was 0.66% by the usual status criterion, 0.92 by the current weekly status criterion and 0.69% by the current daily status criterion. Table 4.8 Annual growth of rural employment, %. Look at the screen for table content. 4.10 Agricultural labor in rural India. 4.10.1 Structure of rural workforce. Economic development involves a process of specialization and diversification in which is a trend towards a decline in the share of the agricultural workforce and an increase in the non-agricultural employment is to be expected. However, available evidence does not present a very clear picture of whether the increase in the non-agricultural component of the workforce is the result of diversification resulting from higher productivity or whether it is merely an increase in the residual category of workers that engage themselves in very low productivity occupations which neither require much capital nor any special skill. There is no doubt that there are considerable regional differences in this respect which need to be studied in greater detail. The two major changes as shown by the recent data are 1. A reduction in the share of workers in agriculture, particularly in the number of self-employed cultivators. 2. An increase in the share of casual laborers. The trends in the composition of the rural labor force, along with the trends in wage rates and those in the extent of unemployment, tell us a great deal about rural reality. In spite of regional diversity in these trends, the overall picture is not very encouraging. Notwithstanding the increase in money wages, real rates have remained more or less stagnant in most parts of the country since the early 60s. Where wage rates increase, the number of the days of employment often falls. As a result, actual incomes do not increase. 4.10.2 Incidence of agricultural labor. Agricultural labor represents the most deprived of all occupational categories in Indian society. This is particularly so given the fact that the scheduled castes make up a great majority of agricultural labor. In 2001, agricultural laborers comprised 33% of the rural workforce and 45% of the agricultural workforce at the national level. Table 3.9. The share of agricultural laborers in rural and agricultural workforce is among the highest in Bihar, Andhra Pradesh and Tamil Nadu and is the lowest in northeastern and hilly states. Official statistics suggest that the incidence of agricultural labor has been on the rise. At the national level, the share of agricultural labor to rural workforce increased from about 30% in 1981 to about 33% in 2001. The NES data suggest that the share of the landless in the total rural households increased from about 35.4% in 1987-88 to 40.9% in 1999 to 2000. The evidence suggests that as a result of increasing mechanization, shifts in cropping pattern and increasing concentration of operational holdings, agricultural growth was less employment intensive in the 1990s than in the 1980s. It should also be noted that female labor is a very important part of the agricultural workforce in India. Table 4.9 shows that at the national level, 43.4% of the rural women workers worked as agricultural workers. In contrast, the share of the agricultural workers in the male workforce was only 27.5%. This indicates that a greater proportion of working women in rural areas depend on agricultural wage employment for their livelihood than their male counterparts. Table 3.9 Agricultural laborers in rural India, 2001. Look at the screen for table content. 4.10.3 Agricultural wages in India. Collection of statistics on agricultural wages is very poor in India. There are serious problems of consistency between the data available from the two main sources: agricultural wages in India and the Rural Labor Inquiries primary database. Studies have often presented facts that are quite different from what is borne out by the official statistics. Keeping all the limitations in view, however, it is possible to make some broad observations regarding the trends in agricultural wages.
First, agricultural wages remain very low in most parts of the country. The low wages, together with the massive underemployment among agricultural workers, provide them incomes that are absolutely inadequate even for minimal subsistence. Second, agricultural wages in most parts of the country were stagnant through the 1970s. In the 1980s, real agricultural wages grew in many parts of the country. It has been argued that agricultural wages were driven upwards during this period because of the large expansion in non-agricultural employment in this decade. But the data from both agricultural wages in India and rural labor inquiries suggest that the growth of agricultural wages slowed down in the 1990s. Check your progress. 5. 1. Which states have a relatively high rate of incidence of agricultural labor? You may refer to data from 2001 census to answer this question. 4.11 Let us sum up. Agriculture continues to be the main sustaining force for the vast majority of India's population even after 4 decades of development. In this unit, we concentrated our attention on the characteristic features of Indian agriculture and its performance over the years. The natural resource endowments obviously vary across the country, but the fact remains that performance of the Indian economy in general and of agriculture in particular depends heavily on the vagaries of the monsoon. Sections 4.2 and 4.3 discuss some basic features of agriculture in India. In Section 4.4, attention was focused on the crucial issue of productivity increases in agriculture. It was pointed out that since there is virtually no scope for further increase in the net sown area, rise in productivity and extension of multiple cropping through the provision of irrigation are the only means of increasing production in the agricultural sector. In sections 4.5 and 4.6, we took a closer look at some of the economic activities related to agriculture, animal husbandry, poultry, fishing, etc., and non-agricultural activities. We also saw that all these activities are linked to agricultural production. Over time, however, because of the changes in technology, these activities are also witnessing a phase of commercialization. This has led to a break in their direct link with the agricultural sector. In Section 4.7, we looked at one of the most disquieting aspects of the rural economy: the uneven spread of rural assets. The fact that economic growth has not been accompanied by equitable distribution of incomes and assets is a cause for worry. In particular, distribution of landholdings continues to be extremely unequal because of the poor implementation of land reforms in most parts of India. Rural households need credit for productive activities as well as for shortfalls in consumption. In Section 4.8, we learned that there was an impressive growth of rural banking in India in the 1970s and 1980s. Although the growth was unequal across regions and across classes, it did contribute to at least partially loosen the control of informal moneylenders on the rural credit markets. The available data suggests that there has been a decline in the provision of credit to rural areas in the 1990s. This has emerged as one of the most serious problems in recent years. In Section 4.9, we covered some of the key concepts employed in defining employment status and looked at the trends in growth of rural employment. In Section 4.10, while outlining some major changes in the distribution of rural workforce in the country, we saw that the number of casual laborers has increased over the years even as the number of workers involved in non-agricultural occupations has increased. A look at the composition of the rural labor force shows that the concentration of agricultural labor is more pronounced in certain states. We have also seen that the prevailing wage rates in agriculture in most parts of the country are very low. 4.12 Keywords: cash crops, crops grown for sale in the market and not for self-consumption. Cropping intensity, the intensity of the use of land, i.e. the number of crops grown in the same plot of land within the same crop year. Fallow lands, land that is left uncultivated for a few seasons so that the soil may recoup itself. Gross cropped area, net sown area plus the area that is sown more than once in a single year. Gross domestic product, value of all goods and services produced within the country in a year. Marginal holding, a land holding of less than 1 hectare. Net sown area, cultivated area in the country. Operational holding, area managed by a cultivator household. It includes subtenancy. Ownership holding, area under legal ownership. Thank you, we will see you in the next video.